There's a tendency in the logical human mind to try to draw straight lines between one thing and another, to understand causal relationships in this way, to understand chronology in this way. But there's also a great value in allowing our minds to digress, to move in different and sometimes eccentric directions. So I want to talk for a little bit about how we develop the ability to digress or to cultivate the digressive mindset. One of the ways that we think about this idea of digression is in terms of getting lost. And by getting lost, I don't mean in the sort of common sense of losing our way, although that is certainly part of it. I mean it more in terms of dislocating ourselves from this sort of notion of continuity. So, for example, we get lost in a moment, that we're not seeing it as part of the larger arc of a day or a week or a journey or something like that, but we're simply sort of standing in the presence of something in a given moment and it overwhelms us in one way or another. That's one version of getting lost. Another is to get lost in the narrative that we construct around a moment or an experience or the arc of a day or a journey or something like that. In other words, we've constructed some sort of structure for understanding it, and we allow ourselves to think that that is the experience itself, right? And we do this very often when we're reading or when we're watching a movie or a television show. We allow it to sort of overwhelm the experience of the larger experience of reality. It's also possible to get lost in something that is used to literally define space. We can get lost in the map that we're constructing or has been constructed for us, that we find ourselves at a point on that map that we see as this kind of two-dimensional blue dot or something like that, and suddenly we are there. We're actually in that particular location, and we're there entirely, which is to say not in relation to anything else. We're not thinking about what borders it or how far away we are from some other point on the map. We're simply in that spot. So getting lost, this idea of being digressive in getting lost, really has to do with allowing ourselves to be isolated within a particular context and not thinking of the larger one. Of course, this requires us to sort of rely on our internal compass, which is to say, our ability to sort of find our way through things, even when the coordinates of them aren't obvious to us. And we've developed this ability partly through evolution and survival, but also simply because our brain is constantly trying to order things. So we will find, for example, in any experience, some points of reference, whether it's the North Star or it's a street sign, or we understand something about the grid of the city, or we understand something about the topography of it, or we remember passing a certain point, so we know that we've been there before and we can return to it. Our brain catalogs, indexes these points of reference, and we merely need to sort of relate back to them to find them. Connected to this is the idea of association, our brain's ability to kind of find a rhyming relationship between one thing and another. It isn't always a rational one. It isn't this leads to that, which leads to that. It's more this thought makes me think of that, or this experience made me feel a particular way. And we catalog those associations. We feel them in ourselves. Most broadly speaking, we feel them at the level of instinct, that our brain and our body very often simply either knows or intuits some way to go or some means of finding our way out of that feeling of lostness. Now, the value of this internal compass isn't simply that it brings us back to something familiar, but that it allows us to feel safer in that experience of being lost in something, that will allow ourselves to sort of be in the reverie of the moment, knowing that once that moment has passed and our brain has moved on to some other activity, we will, at some level, be able to find our way back. One of the great things about the digressive mindset is that it feeds into the way in which our brain works, which is to say sort of ritualistically. And I refer to this as the kind of circular path, which is to say, for example, that we go out into the world knowing that we're going to return, right? That we we recognize that that maybe the way out wasn't clear to us, but as long as we trace our way back, trace our footsteps, trace that trail of breadcrumbs, we will be able to return to the point of origin. In other words, beyond instinct, beyond association, beyond even points of reference, we're good at homing. We're good at kind of finding our way to the point of origin. Partly because we're constantly repeating these activities, right? We create a sort of ritual in our explorations, that whether it's going for a daily walk, even if the course of the walk changes from day to day, there's simply that pattern of behavior that we build into our brains, and it allows us to move out into unfamiliar spaces with some confidence. That repetition teaches us that we will be able to return, that we will come home. This is related to a kind of human understanding of our experience, right? What's referred to as the sort of myth of the eternal return. This is an idea that was talked about a great deal by an anthropologist by the name of Mircea Eliade when he was describing Western mythology. When he's talking about, for example, the stories of Odysseus's return, and there are plenty of modern and contemporary examples of that as well, right? This idea that human beings are always circling out in order to circle back, to come to the point of origin again, having brought their experiences with them, new knowledge, new understanding, new wealth, new opportunities, etc., and they return to that point of origin. We make that big circular path, not nullifying it, not by simply coming back to where we started, but being changed by that experience. And if we're not willing to digress, which is to say not simply worry about moving from point A to point B, if we're afraid that going to B and then back to A is somehow or other losing what we gain in moving that direction, then we lose an enormous amount of value in our experience. We may collect points along a line, but we don't necessarily understand why that line is there to begin with and why we would want to journey out and return back to begin with.